Hey everyone, this is Chris Miller and you're listening to the EduMind Podcast. If you're an architect, project manager, or a nurse, or maybe you're just curious about these career paths, then our podcast is one that you're not going to want to miss. Each week, we'll be talking to subject matter experts, course instructors, and other special guests to bring you the latest and greatest in architecture, project management, and nursing, and a whole lot more. Now, let's dive in. I'm Chris Miller, and today we got a special guest, Mr. Nathan Gulash. He's going to talk to us about his coolest project ever. So let's welcome him aboard. Nathan, thanks for coming on this morning with me. How are you today?
Very good, Chris. Thank you. It's a cold day in Denver. We're about 12 degrees this morning.
Ooh, man. I was wondering where you're at. I'm in Columbus, Ohio, and it was 2 degrees this morning when I woke up. So I can feel your pain. It's cold.
12 degrees and snow, so we'll look forward to some skiing this weekend.
Oh, how much snow are you guys getting?
City got about 5.5 yesterday, but the mountains have had a couple good weeks. The bases are up somewhere around like mid 40s, low 50s for inch total. So it's better than it was a couple weeks ago for sure.
Well, sounds good. Well, hey, Nathan, if you could just kind of tell the audience a little bit about yourself, we'll get rolling along.
So I am an architect in Denver, Colorado. I work for a firm called Semple Brown. We've got about 40 people out here, kind of depending on the day. And we do work in just about every market except healthcare. Personally, I do quite a bit of work in the performing arts arena, a lot of higher end single family work, and then the occasional restaurant and some stuff in hospitality. And I'm also an instructor at CU Denver. So I teach a design studio with a couple other people, generally twice a year. So we'll do spring semester and fall semester. I've been in professional practice for, I think this is year 15, it might be 16, lose track. I graduated from University of Michigan with a Master's of Architecture degree in 2008, and I've been in Denver ever since.
Sounds exciting. A couple of things kind of caught my ear there, Nathan. Before we go on, I can't let it continue, but let's see if we can survive this together. I'm in Columbus, Ohio. So, and also I noticed the color of your shirt.
Yes.
I'm thinking a little bit of Wolverines is coming out of you.
Just a little bit. And it actually, it gets worse than that, depending on your perspective. I have an undergraduate and first master's from Michigan State, which is the other Michigan school. And then went to University of Michigan for my graduate degree in architecture. So there's certainly a rivalry between U of M and Ohio State. We've actually got a couple people at the office here that have degrees from Ohio State. So it's a friendly rivalry for sure, but it is definitely there.
It is. I understand that. I'm a big Tom Izzo fan, so Michigan State doesn't bother me as much as Michigan. But I will say, I took this year's defeat kind of okay because, it's good for college football when Michigan football is good.
True.
So it's a healthy rivalry. It used to be one-sided. And, I grew up watching Ohio State, Michigan. I'm from Southern California, so kind of odd that I'm in Ohio, but I'm a big Buckeye fan. I used to watch, Ohio State be 10-0, 11-0, come to the game against Michigan, they lose. The John Cooper years. So I've been in Columbus since 2004, and I think I've only gone through, 1 or 2 losses. So we're going to survive, but I'm a little disappointed in the team that screened you and brought you on today. I'm going to have a little discussion with them later today. But Nathan, but seriously, it's great to have you on board, for today's podcast. When I was going through the questions, like, holy cow, I said, this is going to be kind of cool. So if you would, let's talk about what your coolest project was, or if you want to jump into that.
Yeah. 2008 was interesting. The economic conditions, not particularly great. And it was worse on the coast, certainly. And as I was looking for where I wanted to end up, I had done a couple of previous summer internships in Denver, different companies than I ultimately accepted my first job with. But Denver was a city that I had spent some time in. My parents used to bring us out to ski during spring break and that kind of stuff. And it just felt more like home than Michigan ever did. And I will consider myself lucky more than anything, because as the coasts were experiencing some pretty awful job losses in art and architecture design specifically, Denver was still doing quite well. And the government projects in the firm that I was at the time were, as the principals would say, they were keeping the doors open. So the Department of Energy has a facility in Golden, Colorado, which is just north of Denver, I don't know, 20, 25 miles. And that facility goes by an acronym of NREL, so NREL. It's the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a laboratory where they do a bunch of research into renewable energies. They've got wind facilities out there. There's solar testing beds. They do both installation, testing, and sort of verification activities, but also just a ton of product research. And the number of people out there continues to grow every year. So there was a competition that was announced, if I get my years right, it was probably 2006, maybe early 2007. And the firm that I ultimately started working with had entered the competition as a design build partnership with a local contractor out here in Colorado, and was awarded the contract. So when I signed on to this particular company, the design competition had been won. The bulk of the design work was in place. The product that was presented as part of this competition was a really heavy schematic design package. So at the time that I started with the company, we were finishing up documentation and then starting construction on what would ultimately be about 256,000 square feet of office space, research space, number of sort of support spaces. But the fact that it was a government project, scale that it was at the time that it was, and ultimately some of the requirements that would have come along with doing some work for a renewable energy lab, net zero requirements, all of those kinds of things. It still to this day is I would say the coolest. It had the most neat things, new tech, new features. The scale of it was pretty interesting. So it was a research support facility at NREL, at the National Renewable Energy Lab. That's definitely the coolest I've worked on.
That sounds pretty cool. I appreciate you sharing that. So, when you get out, when you graduate, you start working for a company or a firm, you don't maybe know what's in tow for you, right? Maybe they put you on a small project, or maybe they'll let you maybe watch a larger project. So, were you expecting to work on something this large?
I wasn't expecting it. I tell my students here that you generally don't get what you don't ask for. And I think part of the challenge there is that when you're so new, you don't necessarily know what you don't know, and you certainly don't know what to ask for. So I had taken a survey of everything that the office was working on, and I didn't have skill sets that would match one project any better than the other. But for some reason, I was particularly interested in this one. And I think it was the sort of tech heavy side of things. There weren't too many LEED Platinum facilities at the time. And ultimately, this one would end up being the largest LEED Platinum net zero for a number of years after we finished. So there was just enough sort of flash associated with this that it was something that I knew I wanted to be involved in. And I approached a couple of the managing principals and I asked, but it was more of I would like to be on this project. So how do we make that happen? How do I contribute? What do I need to do to get on this team? And you don't get what you don't ask for. And that's where all of this started, was asking to be associated with this team in that project.
That's pretty cool. And, and you're absolutely right. If you don't ask, you don't get. So that's awesome. So fantastic. So one thing that kind of caught my ear again, you were talking about net zero. Can you explain what it means to be net zero, and also, why is it such a commendable accomplishment?
Yeah, so it's not that the definition changes so much, but it has evolved over the course of the last decade, certainly. At the time we were working, net zero as a goal was that you would somehow produce as much energy as you would consume. Now, it's not necessarily a one-for-one at any given time, but it's an average over the course of a year. So with the amount of solar exposure that we have out here, some other on-site generation opportunities, the consumption of the building would be offset by the amount that the building was able to generate year to year. So January 1 through December 31st. At the time, the size of the facility is what was, I think, most challenging. LEED as a system was probably in version, 3.2 at the time. I don't think they'd quite transitioned to version 4. And platinum achievement was it was difficult. It was difficult for this type of building. It was difficult for a building of this size. And we would tell ourselves at the time that we were interested in Platinum Plus, which was essentially platinum certification. But any point that we felt that we were eligible for, we had a goal to attain or to achieve those points. And we were successful in that. And the goal of net zero is something that was associated with the project from the government's perspective. So it was a requirement of the project. And to design something that you were confident would meet those net zero requirements was quite the challenge. Now, ultimately, you have to go through some sort of post-occupancy verification process to figure out whether you are or not, in fact, at that net zero threshold. And at the 5-year mark, we had met net zero thresholds in years 0 through 5. And that was the end of the required recording period specific to the design team. But the large commercial projects team that's out at NREL continues to measure the performance of the building, and it's a dashboard that's available as part of NREL's website out there, and you can see on any given day what's being consumed from an energy standpoint, from a water consumption standpoint, but you can also see what's coming in, and they will show you the positive or negative balance for the year, and it continues to perform quite well, 15 years on.
That's incredible, fantastic, and that's actually it's really interesting to learn. So I appreciate you sharing that. So,
Sure.
Which specific building features contribute to a better energy performance? Sometimes you have skylights, you have solar panels.
Yeah. For us, I think it started with how the building was sited. The amount of solar access, access to here in Colorado is pretty great. And we say that we get 300 days of sunshine a year, and that stays pretty consistent. And you being in Ohio and myself from Michigan, we don't have that specifically during the winter months. It gets pretty gray for a good long time. But looking at how you would orient a building with essentially a long facade oriented east-west so that you get southern exposure, that's where we started. There's a crafted amount of glazing on that south side so that we can benefit from heat gain during the winter, but then ultimately provide shade during the summer. So whether or not the sun is directly overhead or if it's lower on the horizon, being very specific about how you allow sun into that building. So orientation, certainly the size of windows or the location of the glazing assemblies is important. And then there are opportunities for devices that both shade but also kind of reflect some of that captured light, relatively deep into the floor plate. So we're fairly narrow from a floor plate perspective. We were 60 feet interior clear, which is a pretty narrow footprint, but very, very long. So if people are looking up this particular building, from a plan perspective, we called the original siting as sort of lazy H. So you've got 2 long horizontal bars oriented east-west, and then this little connector piece in the center. And ultimately, there was a second phase of this, which added another long bar up to the north. So it's kind of a lazy double H. But I think first and foremost, siting something appropriately. And then, some of the technologies that people would be familiar with. High performance glazing is important, certainly had a skylight component. Solar panels were a big piece. There was a device on the southern facade called a transpired collector, which is basically a metal box that gets super hot with sun exposure. And when that box heats up, if we pull air out of the inside of that box, we're getting pre-charged warm air into the building system without having to use energy to actually heat that air up. So yeah, a number of different kind of unique strategies for its time.
Well, cool. Yeah, sounds pretty cool. Thanks for sharing that as well. So as I was going down the list of questions for today, another one caught my eye and I'm going to ask. So what are radiant slabs?
Radiant slabs. In this particular building, we had concrete floor slabs. You've got a metal deck of sort of the corrugated profile that most people are probably familiar with. And then that deck would host some thickness of concrete. And in our case, inside of that thickness of concrete, we had miles and miles of tubing that is wound back and forth in sort of a serpentine fashion. And what happens inside of that tubing is it gets charged with a glycol mixture that is either warm or cold. And because of the sort of mass properties of concrete, the concrete itself ultimately assumes the same temperature as that liquid that's being pushed through those glycol tubes. Now in Colorado, just because of our climate, we're very dry out here. It is not advisable for us to do radiant cooling because we have considerable condensation challenges when we do that. But radiant heating is something that is very effective out here. So being able to warm that glycol mixture and circulate that mixture through the mass of a concrete floor slab, ultimately the concrete slab assumes that temperature. And then, similar to walking by a building that's sort of been sun-baked in the afternoon, you can kind of feel that heat on the side of your face. It's exactly that same concept, but from the floor rather than from a wall condition. And it's a very effective, efficient way to heat a space, and it keeps interior temperature conditions very, very stable within a really narrow kind of temperature band. Super comfortable.
That's interesting. So I got a question, maybe a little off target or topic, but I think it has to do with radiant heating. Maybe something similar to what you're talking about. So my parents lived in Albuquerque for a while. My dad still lives there, and they had a house built. And I remember I was over one day, and I feel my feet as I'm walking through on the tile in the house. Like I'm like, holy cow! I'm like, what's this? What's this heat? But it's called radiant heat. Is that similar to what you're talking about?
Yep. Residential, it's fairly common, particularly here in the mountain climates, generally in bathrooms or in places where you've got hard surface for floors. So bathrooms, kitchens, sometimes whole house, but it's not certainly not a requirement. But nobody likes to walk into the bathroom in the morning and step on cold tile. So whether it's done through a hydronic method, which is that sort of glycol method we just talked about, or if you look inside of a toaster, you can see those sort of nichrome wires that run back and forth and kind of glow red hot. Similar principle embedded in the grout layer of tile assemblies, where there's actual resistance electric wire that is installed in the grout layer and set on a timer. Using electricity in that case, it will in fact warm the floor. So nice to walk on, and just generally a really comfortable way to heat. Since heat rises if you start at the floor, ultimately that sort of convection cycle does really great things for air circulation and creating a space that is really comfortable to be in. Same thing.
Yeah, no, it's pretty cool. But yeah, I mean, I guess they did it to where it ran through the whole house. So like, even if you're in a bedroom, you lay on the carpet and you're like, wow, this feels good, But no, because the winters in Albuquerque get pretty cold. You're right. Walking on cold tile is not fun.
No
so I can honestly remember or say that I never had cold feet while visiting the folks. So thanks for explaining that. Another thing that kind of popping out at me, and what is night purging?
Night purging, in this particular case, it's a strategy for capturing cool or cold air in the evening or overnight. And we kind of used it twofold here. It was both an attempt to sort of purge out, I don't want to use the word toxin, but that's sort of how we looked at it. Over the course of the day, there's a requirement for a certain number of air changes in a building. I mean, it's a code requirement for sort of any commercial structure. The goal for that purge was, as I said, sort of twofold. A piece of it is just to sort of recharge the air, refresh the air that's in the building. But then the other piece is to expel some of the sort of retained heat that would collect over the course of the day. Because most commercial structures have what we would call a cooling load and not necessarily a heating load. So it's the demand for heating and cooling is not necessarily balanced, particularly in an office environment where you have sort of a higher density of people. People radiate heat, sort of activities of office work, researching, those kinds of things. If a floor plate is computer dense, older lighting systems might have expended a lot more heat. LEDs not quite that big of a deal. But the idea with a night purge is that we have a number of windows, hundreds of windows in this particular facility, and 80% of them were on electronic auto operators. So what would happen is when people would leave the building for the evening, the building management system would say, 7:30, 8 o'clock at night, those windows would open, and the fans, the air handling units, would move into essentially an evacuation mode. and they would create a low pressure condition inside the building. So as the air handling units are expelling air,
Mhm.
all of these openings are pulling air in, which is both cooled because we no longer have solar exposure because we're at night, but also something that we would consider sort of fresh. It doesn't have toner particles from copier activities and those kinds of things. So the purge is that removal of daily stagnant warmed air and replacing it with sort of captured cool evening air from exterior to interior.
That sounds pretty neat, actually.
Yeah.
So, hey, thanks for explaining that. So, at the beginning of the podcast, you talked about a design competition.
Yeah.
So, how do design competitions work?
There are some variables, but in general, there is a client that recognizes a need for a project, a need for a product, and they generally issue what would be called an RFP, a request for proposal, and that proposal outlines essentially what the problem is. And the architecture firms that are looking at these requests for proposals decide whether or not they think they have a good idea to solve this architectural problem. So when competitions are announced, the market doesn't necessarily matter. The facility type doesn't necessarily really matter either. Essentially, the request for proposal is sort of put out to the market, and then firms that feel that they have a particular expertise in a market area or a building type, a geographic area, will look at that request for proposal and decide whether or not they want to offer their problem or offer their solution to the problem. Ultimately, when a selection is made from those companies that respond to this proposal, that is sort of one phase in this design competition. Sometimes you'll start with a larger list. There might be 6, 7, 8 companies that are invited, and they will provide whatever sort of taste of their solution. So you might get some preliminary renderings, some really schematic information about how a project would be laid out from a plan perspective, from a programmatic perspective. And then all of those proposals are kind of weighted. They're given a score, 100%, 50%, 20%, and a selection is made. And at that point, there's a number of things that can happen, but often you'll look at some sort of pricing exercise to see if the proposed solution is something that can be accomplished within whatever budget is available. And then ultimately the sort of remaining phases of the project kind of move from there. But that competition piece is an opportunity for a client to leverage their position and to pull out the best ideas that they find themselves having access to and kind of having a menu to pick from of sorts.
That makes sense. That's pretty good use of resources. So that's
Yeah.
pretty cool. And I just kind of nice to be part of it too. Like if you're on the one that's doing the work for the RFP, so that's pretty neat. We've talked about a lot of pretty cool stuff, and everything from radiant heating to night purge, things like that. So now let's kind of take a fun route. Let's go a little bit to the left here. So what took you to the path that you decided to go down? Did you know right away that, architecture is the way that you wanted to travel, or do you take a scenic route or the more direct route?
It was definitely the scenic route, but it was a scenic route where I knew what the goal was. It was just kind of the time frame that was a little odd. My parents are both they've since retired, but were both public school educators. And they both taught in the same small school district on the, so if you know that Michigan is shaped like a mitten, it's in the tip of the thumb. On a good year, they would graduate 15, maybe 16 kids, super, super small.
Wow.
And my father was a musician and was responsible for all of the band, choral, orchestra activities at this school. So if I had gone to that school district because I had an interest in music, I would have had my father as both a father, but also as a teacher from K through 12, which was not going to happen.
Yeah, that would have been tough.
To what Michigan calls a magnet school, and it's essentially like a boarding school. So the smaller districts that are very spread out would sort of collect together and produce these kind of school districts that would have a focus. So there would be an arts and letters focus. There might be a science and tech focus somewhere. And in some cases, you would go to school Monday morning and you might stay through Thursday evening, sometimes even Friday evening. And it would be treated more like boarding school because it was so far away from where you actually lived. So I was very heavy into music and theater through junior high and high school. And my undergraduate and first master's from Michigan State are in music performance. So I've got degrees in piano, a little bit of composition work, but my performance degree was in trumpet. Wow. And I did some playing for some organizations after I left. It was, one of those, I loved what I was doing, but I knew that I didn't want to do it as a career. The performance route is difficult because unless you're going to pull a chair with some sort of orchestra in a city where you choose to live, you don't necessarily get the choice to pick where you want to live and then work. It's sort of the other way around. And I had watched how my father's track went, and he very much enjoyed the education side, but I was pretty sure that I wouldn't enjoy music education. That wasn't something I was interested in. So when all of my options ended as far as education was concerned, I had sort of taken it as far as I could go. University of Michigan was sort of unique at the time, but there are a number of these types of programs now where you can enter a graduate program with a background in something else. So they would accept graduate architectural candidates with a background in whatever, as long as you had a handful of prerequisites, studio art, calculus, physics, those kinds of things. So I was in an incoming graduate class at the University of Michigan with lawyers, people who were practicing medical professionals. We had economists, had a poet, and it was wonderful because you had a group of people with very different backgrounds attempting to solve the same architectural problem in any number of different ways, which is, it influences the way I practice now because I enjoy the performing arts work very much, and being able to sort of work on the design side, but with an understanding about how a facility needs to function. Having been a performer in the past is kind of unique. But I tend to approach my architectural practice from a background that is just different than most people that I practice with. And that there's a graduate program at UC Denver that is very similar. It's sort of modeled after University of Michigan's program. And when I have the opportunity to teach in those graduate studios, boy, that's the best, because you get a breadth of curiosity. Because people are desperate. They don't know how to solve a problem architecturally, so they're going to figure it out from an economics perspective, from a medical perspective. And what they end up with is so much more rich because of that background that they're coming from. So I think that answers the question.
Yeah, that's an incredible journey, a very interesting journey. I mean, thanks for taking us along for that ride. What an interesting program that Michigan has, and then also Colorado has. I mean, it is kind of cool that you're all interested in architecture, but you all come in from different backgrounds and experiences. I think that adds a lot of flavor to that group, and that's pretty cool. Definitely brings a lot of different thinkers together, right? A lot of different ways people think. Maybe economists are very analytical, and so that's interesting. So that's pretty cool. I mean, hopefully more programs like that pop up across the country. So let me ask you this. So you're at you went to the local high school and it's career day, and you're there and a senior walks up to you and says, Nathan, I'm thinking I want to go the architecture route, but I'm not sure, maybe which way to go, or can you give me any good advice? What would you give?
Architecture, I look at it from just my experience. So 2008 through now, my understanding of architecture as a profession in 2008 was very limited. And I think that's generally how I like to talk to people that you should ask, is that the field is considerably more broad than they're probably considering. Sure, there is the romantic sort of portrayal of, toiling away and you're going to design your own house and you're going to live in it and you're going to die in it. That happens. My husband and I are actually working. We're working on a mountain house right now, which is, I'm not going to lie. It's the most professionally fulfilling sort of romantic thing that I've been looking forward to this for longer than I've been practicing, and it is great. But to consider all of the other opportunities, there are teaching opportunities, there are research opportunities. There are people that I went to school with that are now doing set construction for movie studios in Los Angeles, or people that are traveling with theater groups that are assisting with set construction or set modification on the road when they move from theater to theater. A design education, if you sort of approach it the right way, if you engage the right way, if you treat it the right way, and you really invest yourself in a quality design education, particularly at the undergraduate level, you still have every opportunity open to you. If you want to go into the construction trade, if you're interested in engineering, I generally encourage people, if you want to practice as an architect, there's essentially a requirement that you pursue a master's degree. There are some 5-year programs out there which will allow you path to licensure, but we'll kind of set those aside for a second. Generally, your education track is going to be 4+2, 4 in the undergraduate and 2 at the graduate level. That's fine. If people have the time and people have the interest, I generally suggest that they do similar to what I did, which is a 4+3. Take that extra year and know that you're going to spend 3 years in graduate school, but do something else in undergraduate, because you will come out of the experience at the end with a robust understanding of what it means to be a designer, but you will come out with all of the other stuff that you've exposed yourself to in that first 4 years. Arts and letters, science, culture, rather than doing 4 years of undergraduate architecture and then doing another 2 years of graduate architecture. Look at your other opportunities for that first 4, and that sort of design focus, that arts and letters focused education will offer you every opportunity under the sun before you decide to pursue that for graduate school. And that's always my advice to people is the field is broader than you probably know right now. And this particular education track affords you all of those options.
That's some incredible advice. I like it. I agree with you in the sense that, do something else, knowing that you're going to, come out in 2 years with that. That's fantastic. You say it's a broad field, and I agree. And you just mentioned 2 things that I know there's some building to it, but I wouldn't have really placed architecture with it. And that's traveling for let's say you go to Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah.
They have all those sets. I would never, I know they're building, I don't know what you call them, backgrounds and drops and that, but I would have never thought architecture. And then also you were saying you had some, people that are working on sets out in LA for movies. And I wouldn't have thought of that directly related to architecture as well, which may be naive, but, you just think, hey, you want to go into movies and you're going to pick to be a props guy and that's what you are. But that opens a couple of extra doors there for people to consider as well. That's pretty cool. I appreciate that, Nathan. You talked about, we just mentioned the word, or the phrase path to licensure, right?
Yep.
So can you talk about your experience with the ARE exam?
So this is a minefield for me because my experience is, first of all, not recommended, not typical, and probably not even smart. But but yes, I will share it with you. I still do a lot of licensure teaching. We put a program together out here for AIA Colorado that was ran for 6 years, I think, maybe 7, when the previous version of the exam was still being offered. And that was always the question, how do I do this? I'll give you my experience first and then kind of give you generally what my recommendation would be second.
Sure.
Because of that project that we talked about early on, my hours at the office on average were somewhere between 65 and 75 hours a week. And the reason for that is because at the time, the general contractor they were fielding 2 crews. So it's a strategy that's called a rolling 40. And basically the way it works is you have one crew that comes in and works 4 tens, so Monday through Thursday. And then on Thursday's an overlap day, and you have a second crew that comes in and works Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And then the whole thing starts over on Monday again. If you have the sort of amount of area to distribute that number of people, and you sort of have the management protocols in place, super effective. That means from a design standpoint, though, that you are supporting a considerable amount of construction activity. So I kind of geek out on the research side of things, love to read, and I have a photographic memory, which helps. I was finished with IDP in less than 2 years, so all of those hours were taken care of in just under 2 years. And I scheduled the time, my 7 exams over 9 days. I just took them all. So my situation at the time was that sort of all of my time was my own. The licensure goal was red hot. I knew that it was something that I wanted. The project supported the kind of amount of information that was coming my way, and it just sort of made sense at the time to just get it done. I don't think that that's smart for most people, for almost all people. But what we put together here in Colorado, which was very successful, and I think a version of this works with the current exams. If you find yourself in a position where you're kind of balanced between sort of book knowledge and then the practical knowledge. Mm-hmm. And I think the balance has shifted a little bit with the current version. It's becoming a little bit more practice heavy, which is okay. We set up a program which encouraged candidates to take 1 exam a month for 6 months. And then there was a kind of an odd one out there, which was the old schematic design exam, which we suggest you just kind of slip in there somewhere when you needed a break. And we were very successful with that. There were certain pairings of divisions that made some sense. You'd take construction documents, schematic design, site planning and development, kind of all of those things sort of packaged together. And then the more techie stuff was also collected. So structures, the old means and methods, the mechanical exam, those kinds of things. I think a version of that still works, and the fact that there are now 6 divisions rather than 7 reduced from the previous 9, it aligns itself really well with a 6-month effort. And the fact that the retest frequency or the retest, the length requirement has been reduced. If you have a year where you say, 22 is my year, schedule all 6, January, February, March, April, May, June. If January doesn't go well, shake it off, get over it. Take February. February through June goes great. As July comes around, you can reschedule your January exam. It's a way to help somebody understand how you break apart something that kind of seems unmanageable. The effort is probably somewhere between a 40 and a 60-hour book study effort per exam for most people. And if you tell them that you're basically going to work your full-time job and then you're going to add another 25% on top of that every week, most people can find a way to make that happen. Mm-hmm. And if you tell your professional colleagues, if you tell your spouse, if you tell your family, I need your support for 6 months, maybe 6 months and a couple, so that I can hit this professional milestone, people are going to be okay with that. Employers will support that. Your family will help with that. And that has, over the years has become my recommendation. Don't do what I did, because it doesn't work unless you're in a very specific set of circumstances. But the 1 a month thing, that works. That's manageable.
That's some great words of wisdom. I appreciate you also sharing the path that you took and recommended maybe a less stressful way, maybe. But no, that's some great advice for people that are, not just thinking about taking the ARE exam, but also maybe they're somewhere in between divisions and they're like, I'm going to push them off for, 6 months or something. This kind of at least gives them an idea that, what, it's doable in 6 months.
Yep.
I like the timeline that you gave. So, as we're coming to an end here today, Nathan, we covered a lot of great topics, had some great personal stories intertwined in with our more professional topics that you talked about. So I appreciate you coming out. I'd love to have you back, talk about some other architectural related topics. It'd be great to have you. In the meantime, enjoy the snow, get some good skiing in there. But if I were to say, Nathan, as you're signing off for the day, any words of wisdom to throw out to the world there?
Where we're sitting right now, most of us, it's either at home in front of the computer or in an empty office. And design, architecture, I kind of look at life as sort of a collaborative effort. And I look forward to being in a position where classrooms are full again, offices are full again, because I think we do our best work when people question what we're doing and we can question other people. Is that advice? No, it's what I'm looking forward to. I am looking forward to rooms full of people because I do my best work when I'm surrounded by people who challenge what I say.
Nathan, I could not have said it better myself. I agree with you. I'm looking forward to that as well. Not just, in a professional aspect, but, I'm looking forward to kids being able to go back to school, stay in school instead of having to deal with a remote or a hybrid type learning. I, with you, also work better when people see what I do and also can challenge what I do on a daily basis. So to everyone out there, have a great week.